Okay, well, good afternoon or good evening, depending upon where you are. My name is Patrick from the Poison Pen Bookstore in Scottsdale, Arizona. And Barbara and I are going to be hosting two of our absolute favorite writers tonight. The occasion is to celebrate the publication of Kathleen Kent's brand new book, Black Wolf. Remarkable book. Can't wait to get into it. Kathleen, as always, was kind enough to sign a bunch of them for us. So I'll put a link in the comments field if you'd like to purchase one of the few remaining ones we have. And we also have, I think, 3 signed copies left of Dan Fesperman's most recent book, Winter Work. And I must say, they make a nice companion set, don't they? I mean,
They do.
Aesthetically. So welcome both of you. And thanks so much, Dan, for agreeing to do the interview.
Thank you, Patrick, and thank you, Barbara, and thanks for the poison pen as always. So
yeah, Barbara, anything you'd like to add? We're both going to lurk, I think, because we both loved this new book so much. We'll probably pitch in with some questions.
I probably should do some kind of a formal introduction for Kathleen, just for yucks. And so I've gone to her website, which any of you, of course, can't naturally do, but here we are. Anyway, she grew up in Texas, but lived in New York for 20 years, began writing full-time, and in 2008 published her first novel, The Heretic's Daughter, down its 12th printing, published in 17 countries. Then she wrote more historical fiction, The Trader's Wife and The Outcast, and she loves historical fiction. Patrick, I think, did you get to know her with The Dime, Patrick? Was that the book that I think it was? And The Burn, which was nominated for an Edgar, the Sue Grafton Memorial Award for a strong female protagonist. Then she wrote The Pledge, published in 2021. And now here we are with Black Wolf, which is a great spy thriller. Patrick was inspired to suggest that fans of Dan Fesperman would really like Black Wolf. I'm going to throw in a pitch for Alma Katsu, because her upcoming book, Red London, and her previous book in this particular line, because she writes different things, called Red Widow, is amazing. And Alma was actually worked for the CIA. So she has some strong background, and she will be with us on March 12th. So it's really fun to have a kind of cluster. And I think another really fascinating thing, since I am old enough to have lived through the entire cycle, is that we're back in the Cold War. We are back where Russia is really our principal antagonist, again, in spy thrillers, having, we cycled through the sandbox, we've cycled through China and Korea and all, but Russia is like the target, which in many ways is difficult for you guys writing, unless you're writing historical, because you have to keep up with what's actually happening in Russia and Ukraine. But fortunately, that doesn't come in. Dan has written his marvelous series, well, not a series, but actually a whole bunch of books, all the way from what was the first book? What I'm trying to remember.
Lie in the Dark, set in Bosnia, but during
Bosnia. Thank you. I was going back on black on Bosnia, but we've been all around the world with you. Although I don't recall that you've done a book in Asia. Have you had an Asian background?
No, unless you can count Pakistan there. A lot of my book in Pakistan and Afghanistan, The Warlord's Son, was.
Well, I was thinking Southeast Asia. Maybe.
Yeah, right. No, not that far east. Yeah.
Anyway, Eurocentric. So we'll see. And anyway, Dan and Kathleen, I'm going to turn it over to you, but I wanted to kind of give readers a flavor of what we're going to be talking about.
All right.
Great. Thanks a lot, Barbara.
Yeah. So Kathleen, I want to know, first of all, you lived a lot of these events, or at least you were living in this period and traveling there as a Department of Defense contractor. You, like some of the characters in this book, were concerned with stopping maybe some of the dangerous nuclear proliferation, with all of these nukes suddenly possibly up for grabs and this book is set in Belarusia, which at the time was a republic of the USSR, the Soviet Union. Right. And the Berlin Wall had fallen 8 months or so before, but the Soviet Union hadn't yet crumbled, or not officially anyway, but there were certainly cracks in the foundation. And tell us about what you share with your main character, the fascinating Melvina Donlevy, And tell us about some of your experiences and how that brought this novel about.
Right. Well, like Barbara, I'm old enough to be a part of the duck and cover generation.
Same here. Yeah.
Yeah, I remember in grade school, we had drills where we would hide underneath our desks as though that would protect us from a nuclear attack from
Yeah.
Russia. But I grew up, Russia was the evil empire. It was our number one threat to our uh, security, national security. And so there was always this shadowy background, remembering the Cuban Missile Crisis. Um, I was very fortunate in 1990 to have been working for a US company that had already made inroads into Belarus. As you said, Dan, 1990, a few months after the fall of the Berlin War, a lot of the republics had announced their sovereignty, but not quite yet their independence. That would come a
Right.
year or so later. So
Right.
it was this very fluid, chaotic,
Yeah.
dangerous time because the U.S. government, the State Department, became aware of the fact that the crumbling Soviet Union had 27,000 nuclear missiles and uncounted tons of biological weapons and chemical weapons. And so, fortunately, there were few lawmakers, Sam Nunn being the driver of this, Senator Sam Nunn, went to Moscow and asked Mikhail Gorbachev soon after he had been reinstated after the populist uprising. And he said, who's guarding the vault? Who's guarding the weapons? And he said, let's change the subject, because he knew that the silos were unmanned. Some of these biological and chemical weapons were being kept in facilities that were locked simply with a padlock. So it was with hair-raising alarm that the US government started the Nunn-Lugar Cooperative Threat Reduction Program. And so I was my company and I were one of the early project managers that were under the auspices, the umbrella of the Department of Defense. And I like to say I wasn't CIA, but I was CIA adjacent, because I had to report to the NSA and the CIA, because countries such as Iran and Pakistan were very interested in taking advantage of the chaos. And they had ready cash to spend, to beg, borrow, or steal fissionable material or the weapons themselves. So so in 1990, I became a contractor, and it was a very unique opportunity to see. It was still in flux between the old guard Soviet Union, the KGB was still very active. Afghanistan had really broken the back of the Soviet system, and the civilians were paying mightily for the depredations of war. And yet there was almost this giddy hope that they would become partners to the West. And there were glimmers, there were entrees into Western commerce and Western organizations. So it was a very hopeful time. It was very scary because we didn't know where it was going to go. But that's how I had a unique perspective, in that I spent 10 years in and out of Belarus and Kazakhstan, and was able to see a lot of these changes.
Yeah. Now, it was also, it made it very interesting. Instead of, we're familiar with the Cold War from a lot of classic spy novels, and the rules of engagement were pretty standard and set. But what made this period interesting was that all those rules were suddenly in flux, loyalties were in question. As you said, there was some hope maybe they would form a friendship even with the West. And so even a KGB officer like the Black Wolf in this novel is starting to rethink his own future. And that tell me how that comes into play with several of your characters really looking to the future and wondering what it might hold for them in this uncertain new reality.
Exactly. One of the things I loved about Winter Work, Dan, was that, first of all, our two books are set very close together.
Yeah.
Yours starts at the beginning of 1990 and mine's sort of
Yeah.
the end of the summer of 1990. And your main character, Emil Grimm finds himself in that same position of being a part of the Stasi, being a part of the old guard,
Yeah.
and yet trying to find his balance
Yeah.
on the shifting sands of change.
Yeah.
And I always think that transitional times like that are
Mhm.
really interesting to
Yeah.
write about,
Yeah.
because it brings out the best and worst in humanity, but the
Right.
uncertainty causes this tension throughout the story. When I started traveling to Belarus, all of our drivers, all of our translators, all of our guides were KGB. We knew this. All of our phone calls were tapped. We had two-way mirrors in our hotel room, and
Yeah.
it was just sort of, kind of a gentleman's agreement, sort of, that I watch you, you watch me, and so we knew that. Um, but there was definitely a kind of a relaxing. They didn't really trust us. We didn't really trust them, but there were openings for a little more relaxed company. We went out to dinner with them. We went to their homes. I never was inside the Minsk KGB building, but I had dinner with a lot of the officers, and some of the best jokes that I heard were from KGB officers, and
Yeah.
one of them was the first time I was in Minsk. Um, we were driving in from Minsk to airport, which was a horror show. Outside, it looked
Yeah.
very modern and sleek, but inside, no light bulbs, dangling wires. It was a nightmare. But as we're driving into the main part of the city, um, because so much of Minsk had been destroyed during the Second World War, the Russians used German prisoners of war to rebuild the city. And so it looked very Germanic, and all of especially the municipal buildings, were 4 stories high. And so as we're passing the KGB building, which is 4 stories, our driver said, "Oh, this is the KGB building. It's the tallest building in Minsk." And I said, "But it's only 4 stories like every other building." And he says, "But from the top floor, you can see all the way to Siberia." So there was this sense of, being able to, to find humor. It
Yeah.
was dark humor,
Yeah. Yeah.
but there were little glimmers of humanity and hopefulness. I think the biggest worry that the Soviets had at that time is who's going to pay them.
Yeah.
The infrastructure had fallen apart. Their military, their scientists, their academicians were not being paid, and that's where, U.S. dollars, not unlike the Marshall Plan,
Yeah.
stepped in and invested money in our former enemies as a firewall against future aggression.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
yeah.
You also did a good job of capturing, a couple things in particular. One, the appalling nature of the food in those places at that time. I traveled some in Ukraine and in Moscow at that time, and it was terrible everywhere you went, unless you had a home cooked meal. But
Exactly.
and also how the culturally, socially, everything floated on a sea of vodka. You
Yes.
could not do anything without knocking back shots, whether it was a formal lunch, whether it was a party, a dinner. Vodka was that was part of the conversation, and you had to keep up.
That's right. It was ubiquitous. And one of the amazing things that I discovered was that during the early 90s, when inflation was rampant, they kept the price of vodka low, because
Yeah.
if they hadn't, they would have had a populist uprising of a different kind. And all of the vodka bottles had foil tops,
Yeah.
because once you open the bottle,
Oh yeah, that was it. Yeah.
And,
You weren't supposed to open it unless you were going to finish it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so they, in all of the social functions we went to, the State Department or with the Soviet higher ups, we were expected to drink, and the tradition was that you stand up, you make a toast, and then you knock it back, and then if there are 20 people in the room, you're going to have 20 speeches.
Yeah.
I'm not the biggest drinker, so but I had a colleague that traveled with me quite often, and he was able to kind of sneak. He did kind of sleight of hand and
Yeah.
slide a little glass of water. And so the Russians were thinking, this American woman, she's, she can now
You
drink
can
us
really knock them down. Yeah.
down because I was drinking water. So
Yeah.
it was that was a cultural, that was a cultural must that was very unique to the Soviet
Yeah.
system.
Yeah. Yeah. Now you've done something very deft here in that you've combined a really top-notch espionage novel with also a novel about a serial killer who's sort of entwined into the social and political fabric. We don't know his identity, but he's obviously someone who's in thick with a lot of people who are figuring into the book. Now, is that what you set out to do initially? At what point did it occur to you that you're going to have those two threads, and how did you begin to, because it's tough weaving them together, but you did a great job. But so how did that evolve into those two?
In November of 1990, I was aware, it was publicized, that a man named Andrei Chikatilo, the butcher of Rostov, was arrested after 20 plus years of murdering probably at least 100 women and children across Ukraine and Russia.
Yeah.
He was allowed, or he was able to continue his murder spree because it was anti-Soviet policy to believe in serial killers outside of the decadent West.
Right.
So as Stalin said, there's no murder in paradise.
Yeah.
Which is ironic coming from Stalin.
Since he killed 20 million or so, but yeah.
Exactly. So they were arresting people, but unrelated to the actual murders. And there was a police officer, a detective, who believed that it was a serial killer, but it wasn't until after the Berlin Wall came down and he was allowed to contact the FBI and talk to them about their profiling methods, that he was able to bring in a psychiatrist, and they caught him. They caught Andrei Chikatilo. And that whole story really stayed with me, not only the brutality of it, but trying to understand, some people are just born psychopaths. They're born without empathy, without any conscience at all. But to me, there was an element in studying Chikatilo's life of the brutality of his earlier years, that Russia lost more people in the Second World War than any other country practically combined. I think they lost almost half of their civilian population. Incredible privation, incredible brutality, and it had to have had an effect. And so the Butcher of Rostov is my model for the Svishloch Strangler in Black Wolf. But I wanted to explore, not to excuse, but to explore his path from being a child to being a murderous individual. So that was my model, using Chikatilo as that. And that story never left me. There's a brilliant movie, Citizen X, with Donald Sutherland, Stephen Ray, and Max von Sydow, that does a really good job of chronicling that hunt for him. I think they did a really terrific job of capturing that. So I just, it was something I filed in the back of my mind. And I thought, and it was challenging because a spy novel it's got to be believable and multi-layered. But I thought, why not up the ante? I can play 4-dimensional chess.
Well, also, and you did a nice job using the Black Wolf, the KGB character at the top of the food chain in Belarus and Minsk. And he realizes that there is, as you were just talking about, there is this ideological blind spot in dealing with killers like this because they refuse to believe they exist. And even though he's a very adept investigator and at ferreting out the truth, whether through brutality or other means, he is kind of not very well armed for catching this killer. So,
right. That's, Martin Kavalchuk, who is the Black Wolf, the
Yeah,
head of the Belarusian
yeah.
KGB, is very he's intelligent, he's cunning, he's brutal,
Yeah.
and yet he's a realist, he's a pragmatist, and I think
Yeah.
he realizes that there are changes going on societally.
Yeah.
But first and foremost, he's a patriot. You know,
Yeah.
his country first above everything. And I kind of, one of the iconic relationships in crime fiction or horror fiction is the relationship between Hannibal Lecter and
Yeah.
Clarice Starling.
Yeah.
She's young, she's inexperienced, she's given an opportunity by her higher ups to try to to form a relationship with this man. And Hannibal Lecter never changes, Leopard doesn't change his spots, and yet he recognizes her courage and her tenacity. And so there's kind of a respectful bond there. And so I kind of wanted to pay homage to that, even though Melvina is very different from Starling. I recently wrote an essay for Crime Reads called "The Only Woman in the Room." And I had spent 10 years with the Commodity Exchange, very few women, almost no women working at the Commodity Exchange, and then 10 years as a civilian contractor, whereas everyone from the DoD and certainly my Soviet colleagues, it was all men. But my father, I was very fortunate in that my father growing up, I went hunting with him. He was, he treated me just the same as he did, his sons. But he told me once, he said, there's nothing you can't do that a man can do except lie with a straight face.
Yeah.
But of course, once you start working with the intelligence, you know that that's not necessarily true, that you have to keep a poker face and misdirect or mislead. But I felt, I wanted to give, to highlight a woman who succeeds in a man's world through intelligence and bravery.
And let's talk about Melvina. Melvina Donlevy, she's your main character, and she's working with the CIA, and her special talent is that she's a super recognizer.
Right.
Which means that
a super recognizer was actually not coined to the mid 2000s, but it's it's a real phenomenon. I had in searching for building Melvina's character, I wanted something very unique about her that was kind of a hook. And I read an article in a British paper about a woman named Kelly Hersey, who was hired by the local police constabulary because she was able to pick out, she was given a pre-selected target and picked out hooligans, sports hooligans from thousands of people streaming into a stadium. Her hit rate was close to 100%.
Wow.
So she was shown a picture and she was shown a video, and she'd be able to say, there, and there are your hooligans. The Scotland Yard caught wind of this, and she was hired by Scotland Yard, and they upped the ante because instead of hooligans, she started pinpointing bank robbers and terrorists and really bad actors. Her hit rate again is close to 100%, and she is a super recognizer. And it's so rare that less than 1% of the world's population has this innate ability. It's not something that you can adopt or perfect. They're little mind tricks to improve our memory, but this is something hardwired into some people. So I thought, well, this is really cool. I thought this would be a great attribute to give to Melvina. And like Kelly Hersey, she first starts with the FBI, and then the CIA gets wind of it, and she's given top secret clearance to recognize 3 Iranian scientists who are in Belarus to gain access to nuclear weapons. So that's her job.
Another character who really was fascinating, and then I read at the end that it was based on someone you knew, and that's William Cutler. He was kind of straddling all the worlds. He was an American, but basically born in that part of the world, but an
Right.
American citizen and living there. And he had his fingers into every pie in town. And he was somewhat mistrusted by everybody, but he was also somewhat trusted by everybody. So he made a great intermediary. And he was based on someone you knew, apparently.
Yes. William Cutler was based on one of my colleagues and partners in the American company that traveled to the former Soviet Union. His name was William Bigel. And like I write about William Cutler, William Bigel spoke 7 languages. He was born in Vilnius. He lost 14 members of his family to the Holocaust.
Yeah.
He was a brilliant nuclear physicist. He was a wonderful pianist, and he looked like Santa Claus. You know, he was the least, and he got away with a lot in terms of subterfuge and in terms of misdirection, because he the twinkling blue eyes and the the rosy cheeks, but he was intensely intelligent, ferociously so. And he sort of became my protector in a way. When I traveled to Belarus, I traveled with him quite a bit, and always felt, kind of protected and looked after. And he was always giving me sort of the inside. He could look at somebody and say, "Oh, that's KGB," or "That's," So I wanted to pay homage to William Bigel. He died about 6 or 7 years ago, and he was greatly missed. So I wanted to pay tribute to him, and I thought, what a great representative character. That William Cutler is sort of a go-between between the CIA, but he also has contacts with the Mossad, with Israeli intelligence.
Yeah.
He has contacts with the scientific community, and he plays this very delicate balance between giving the Soviets, because he's living in Belarus, giving the Soviets just enough to keep them interested, but not giving them everything to gain an advantage over the Americans. So I just had a lot of fun building that character.
No, he's a great character. Talk about your research, because you lived in this period and you traveled there and you had some, no doubt, shared experiences with Malvina. But how did you refresh your memories on that? How did you make these live again for you? Did you keep notebooks, or did you travel back to any of these places? How do you bring all that back? Because for me as a journalist, I was in Berlin in some of these times and the East Bloc, and I would just take out my old notebooks and one line, and I can remember how it looked, smelled, sounded. But I was just wondering how you go about that.
Well, I kept a journal, which I wasn't supposed to
good.
keep, because we were in a lot of very sensitive places. One of my advantages was I'm old enough to know Greg's shorthand. I'd studied Greg's shorthand. And so nobody, not even the Americans, could read. And I take notes that I didn't want other people to read in Greg's shorthand. So I kept a notebook. And fortunately, I think, by the time I had retired as a civilian contractor and moved to Texas in 2000, the spy novel, the classic Jean Le Carré spy novel of the Russians, had sort of passed into irrelevance in a way, because Russia wasn't the evil empire anymore. They were seen as potential allies. And so I thought, well, I don't know if this would even be interesting to people, because a lot of the spy and thriller novels moved to the Middle East. Our focus shifted. But a few years ago, because of Putin's interest in the Crimea and his insatiable desire to conquer territory, I pulled out the journal and I thought, this may be relevant again. We had, one of my biggest concerns in Belarus was really not the KGB, but the fact that Chernobyl, which had happened in 1986, irradiated over 80% of Belarus.
Yeah.
So when we were initially shown the maps, the Russian made maps, it looked like, you know, it was just the exclusion zone. It was just 20% of the country.
Yeah.
After being in country for a while, the State Department gave us the real maps, which was 80%. So everything that we ate, everything that we, you know, even the air
Yeah.
that we breathed, was potentially toxic. Cancer rates skyrocketed, infant mortality rates
Yeah.
grew exponentially. So there was this feeling, this dark cloud of what was going to happen, not, you know, a year from now, but 10 years from now.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, and that fear never completely went away.
Yeah.
But so I sent in the finished manuscript to the publisher a week before Putin invaded Ukraine. And I think it is the 23rd, is it not?
Yeah, that's the anniversary. Yeah.
We're exactly a year out from the invasion. And one of the first things he did was send troops into Chernobyl. And this was such a horrible deja vu because, you know, it had slept peacefully under its concrete, you know, in its concrete coffin. And I thought, well, that's one thing we're not going to have to worry about again.
Yeah.
But there were great concerns that it would have another nuclear event. Then he withdraws 1,000 troops back through the exclusion zone with no protective gear.
Right. And they were digging around in the soil and
digging around in the soil. So there's a good chance that there are going to be 1,000 Russians, if they've survived the fighting, are going to have consequences to this.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it was really a horrible deja vu that I don't know if I consciously knew when I was writing the book that it was going to be as aggressive as he turned out to be, but I had a sense that there were going to be problems with Russia. And unfortunately, like Barbara said, we've come full circle again. Problems, radiation, problems with Putin. You know, it was pretty scary.
Yeah, it brings a couple of things to mind. I remember when I was writing Winter Work, I thought, well, some of the villains in it are Russian. And I thought, well, is this going to be passé? And I even had a throwaway reference to Putin because he was a KGB officer in Dresden at the time the wall came down and was appalled by what they let happen. But I also remember when I was traveling, traveling in Poland at that time, you would see in rural Poland, a certain time of year, you'd see mushroom salesmen by the side of the road everywhere out of the forest. And I remember being cautioned. It's like a lot of that dirt, even in Poland, got radioactive fallout, and the last thing you want to be eating is a mushroom. So
and that's one of the greatest traditions of the Russian people, are to go mushroom. I mean, they make entire, you know, fetes and festivals out of it. But by the very nature of its construction, it absorbs radiation. So
exactly.
When we were there, you'd have to test it for radiation, and most of them were irradiated. So,
were you carrying a dosimeter around there?
Oh yes, we had pocket dosimeters the whole time that we were there.
Okay.
And there were elevated where we were. I wasn't in Ukraine, and we were north of the exclusion zone.
Right.
But there were elevated exposures to radiation, and you know, we were assured that it wasn't any more than an X-ray. But if you're getting an X-ray's worth of radiation every week, and I'm in and out of country for 10 years, it caused some concern.
I'm sure.
But it was just, you know, it was sort of, it was such a fascinating time, and I always felt very fortunate to be witness to that. That we were doing something, we were turning swords to plowshares, and I was also in a place that was totally exotic to me. You know, it was a fascinating place.
Tell me about the worst food you had during that time.
So, you know, unless you were invited to someone's dasha, or they had just returned from their dasha where they could, during the summer or early fall when they dug up their vegetables, it was mostly canned or root vegetables. Everything was, you know, meat that was fried, a lot
Yeah,
of
a lot
potatoes,
of grease.
a
Yeah,
lot of grease, a lot of
yeah,
potatoes, a lot of heavy cream, a lot of mushrooms.
yeah.
Um, one of the characters in Black Wolf, one of the young CIA agents, is a man named Benjamin Worthingham Franklin, and he's an
Yeah,
African
yeah.
American man, and he's based on a real CIA agent that traveled with us. He was from the State Department, and I felt so sorry for him because he was a vegetarian, first of all.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
the poor guy almost starved to death.
yeah,
We were
yeah,
there in November. He was wearing a kind of a light trench coat, almost froze to death.
yeah,
Um, and I never understood. He was very, very intelligent. He did speak Russian, but the Russians' response to him was as though he was an alien, that it,
yes,
and why they sent someone to do a clandestine job that was going to be, that was going to stand out as though he glowed from the inside out. So, but we formed a friendship, and he was a lovely guy, and so I put his character into one of the fictional characters in the book.
it's interesting. It reminded me, his experiences reminded me, the time I was in Moscow with some coworkers, and a couple of them were African American, and our host put us up with locals in Moscow who had really had nothing to do with our host or with us. So they had kind of signed up to host these American journalists. And I remember I was at an apartment with a guy, our host was named Anatoly Smirnov, and he was a heavy drinker. And he
Right.
got all of us. And of course, Anatoly comes in late at night when we were trying to get to sleep. And he went up to my friends, Jerry and Bob, both African American. And he was basically staring at them as they lay in bed. He was staring at their faces as if they had no consciousness of this, from about a foot away. And he didn't speak English. We were talking to each other. And I remember, Jerry saying something like, "I'm going to F him up," or something like that. Cause it was like, what is this guy doing? And it was the most bizarre thing. It was like you said, they were treated as exotic animals. They just had no experience with people of color. It was a bizarre thing. Everywhere we went, that happened. So
There's such a wide cultural divide. And some things were overt and some things were more nuanced. For example, when we would go into these military facilities to start the deconstruction or the retooling for civilian use, they had no comparative word in Russian for quality control.
yeah.
It was a concept to them.
Right.
It was if you got an order to make 100 widgets, you made 100 widgets, you'd send them out, and then 20 were defective, they'd be sent back, and then they would be included in the next shipment. It, because you had to meet your quota. It wasn't quality, it was quantity. And so there were, they had lived under Stalin for 3 or 4 generations. And it was an autocratic system. And before that had been the Tsar, and they'd lived as serfs. And so it was it was a huge cognitive leap for the Soviet citizens to suddenly try to embrace the idea of autonomy or democracy in any way, shape, or form. And in a way, even though the free marketplace and the mafia and the black market ran rampant and has run rampant for the last 20 years. There is something, I think, innate in the Soviet mindset that is embracing Putin's strongman stance.
Yeah, there is. Yeah.
I mean, I think it's a lot of the young people who've traveled more and have been exposed more to certain freedoms are not on board with Putin. But the middle-aged to the older people are really falling in line. They're comfortable with an autocracy, and so I don't think there was ever a complete shift, and so there's now a slide back. And so what's going to happen from now on? I'm not sure. I think it's the physicist Niels Bohr said predictions are difficult, especially about the future. You know,
Yeah.
it's,
Yeah.
Good
you know,
point.
I mean, I've talked to so many different people who've had, you know, from the military to intelligence, and it's sort of, you know, no one is really quite sure what's,
Yeah.
you know, what's going to happen.
Listen,
So,
And yeah.
I'm gonna speak up for a minute,
Yeah.
guys, because last night I had a really interesting conversation. We were doing basically military fiction, but two of the guys, they were all former military that are now authors. And one of them said, and I think he's right, that the Russians don't understand a win-win mentality, that they are not interested in win-win. What they basically are interested in is us losing,
Yeah.
not them winning. And
Yeah.
for them, even if they lose, if they made us lose, it's a win. And so, you know, there's it's a completely different way of approaching things. And as a result, he felt that we often miss the point, or that we
Yeah.
don't really understand that the Russian goal is not our goal at all. It is not definitely a win-win. And that's why I think any thought of a negotiation, I mean, you know, I'm not quite old enough to remember Munich and Chamberlain. I would have been -2. But
Yeah.
you know, anyone who thinks that that a negotiated peace that Putin would
Yeah.
stop there
Right.
is
Right.
deliberate, you know, just, I mean, there's no way. He has turned into Alexander, Napoleon, all of these guys that
Yeah.
have this drive for conquest. Also, it's his only survival thing. But here's what I think, and I pointed this out last night. I think we need to be watching the Wagner group and the guy
Yeah.
heading Wagner. I think he's plotting a coup. I
Well,
won't be at all
who knows?
surprised if he does not do that, but he may be actually worse than Putin. So,
well,
you know, we're not necessarily going to be liberated from all this if somebody removes Putin from office, because you've just pointed out there are too many people who
Yeah.
are comfortable with this. And when I was in Russia in 2011, I can remember some of the older people actually missing the Soviet era because it was structured and they knew what was going on, and they are uncomfortable with freedom. They are uncomfortable with decision making and driving their own lives because they lived in an autocracy forever.
Right.
They just
Right.
don't know what to do. And I worry that China is in the same position. They haven't had any, you know, particular freedom since Mao, although they had this brief window of it. And now it's closed again. And I don't know, you know, we should remember that people used to autocracy are not going to move seamlessly into democracy. They're just not going to do it.
you know, that's so true. And I've read, and I don't know if it was General Petraeus, what some American general said that the American military is wonderful at going in and knocking down a strongman or you know, knocking down an institution, a corrupt institution, but we are terrible at rebuilding.
Yeah.
Right. So it's sort of once we've taken out the Shah or whoever our appointed enemy is, there's no, we haven't found an effective way to rebuild a functioning society with functioning infrastructure. And I think a major part of that is a psychological disconnect from what we know and understand and take for granted, and what say the former Soviets have taken for granted. Because even though there have been shortages of food, there was a consistency to the shortages. You know, they knew, like you said, there was structure to it. And I think, you know, Putin is a very prideful man, and I think he felt that he was shunned by the West. He wasn't given his due. And I think he's had plans for a very long time to take back the country. It's already been announced that he wants to absorb Belarus into the Russian Republic. Lukashenko's been president for life since 1992. And I don't think Lukashenko's going to have any problem with that.
As
So
long as he gets to keep doing. Isn't it interesting that Putin is another small man? I just, you know, you have to, you know, I'm serious. You know, I mean, I think there's something in that, you know,
Yeah.
Napoleon, whatever these guys. They were
Yeah.
little, but there's an interesting analogy to the trying to remember the full name of the project in Chicago, the something green, Cabrini Green. That was it, Cabrini Green project.
Yeah.
Because when there was that great migration of African Americans from the South that came up to Detroit and Chicago with the war and so forth. And so they built all these high-rise apartment buildings for them to live in. But nobody thought to tell them how you actually lived in them. And it was astonishingly short time before they broke the plumbing, before, they completely trashed them because nobody had educated them in living in a high-rise structure, in a community structure with indoor plumbing. And, it turned into a disaster. And, there's an awful assumption by people who operate in one plane that given a chance, other people will do the same. But if you
Right.
don't train them in how to do it, they should have had like lavatory classes, for people moving into the building. This is how it actually works.
Well, you had a lot of agrarian people moving into the city, moving from being essentially farmers and living off the land to living in the concrete jungle, and it was a huge huge shift. And I think very quickly a sense of malaise and hopelessness settled in because, as you said, there wasn't any context for it. It was they had moved away from traditions and a life that they had known, and they were put into these big, tall, soulless brick buildings. And there is a context, and there is a period of transition between living one way and living another, transitioning into another way of life. And that takes generations sometimes.
Yeah. And you're talking about the strongman mentality in Russia. I mean, that was true in a lot of the East Bloc. I remember when in the former Yugoslavia, when Milosevic was running for office, and there were all these upstart characters and reformists who ran against him. And one of them was out campaigning, and he gave a speech to a group of people, and someone came up to him afterwards, and he says, "I agree with everything you said, and I think you're great." And he says, "So you're going to vote for me?" He goes, No. But if you show me you can take power too, then I'll vote for you." And it was basically, no, that's not how this works. But he wanted to see if this guy was strong enough to take power, then he would vote for him. But he just couldn't get the idea that, no, it was up to you and all your neighbors. So he wasn't going to vote for him because he had not demonstrated enough strength.
Well, here's a question, Dan. When we went to Vietnam, what did we think we were going to do with it if we won?
Well, it's like Kathleen said. It's like Kathleen said, we're not very good at. I think Americans, whether in the State Department or other places, tended to have this naive idea throughout the Cold War that if we could depose communism, if we could depose a despot who wasn't letting American business do what they wanted to do, then maybe by imposing the American way in terms of commerce and businesses, it will somehow evolve into also the American way in other fields. But people, if you don't have experience with democracy, with elected governments, then you're going to revert to what has been the norm, whether it's under communist rule or under fascist rule or whatever. So I think Americans have always thought, and look at what happened in Iraq. We thought, well, we'll implant a few leaders and prop them up, and then we'll have elections. And it's just, it's not that easy. You can't grow a culture like that by giving people a few tips and propping up a few people who you like. So,
Dan,
I remembered reading a journalist years ago who'd been in Vietnam.
Yeah.
And they had asked some Vietnamese peasants what they thought democracy was.
Yeah.
And they thought it was a kind of rice.
Yeah.
When you're living a subsistence existence and your only thought is to how you're going to feed your family in your next meal, democracy is a very esoteric concept.
Now the CIA early on, or OSS actually, they sent in a DEER team, parachuted toward the end of the Second World War in Vietnam. the one guy they met who did have a very good idea of democracy, and he quoted Thomas Jefferson, and he was patterning his own manifesto after the Declaration of Independence. And he was a young firebrand they were fighting alongside for a few weeks, and his name was Ho Chi Minh.
Right.
And so this
Right.
dear team came back and recommended, I think we can work with this guy. He mostly just wants the French out. He talks about communism, but he also wants to model things on our system. We should probably work with him. And the State Department, appalled, basically said, no, we're supporting the French. And that was the end of that. So who knows where things might have gone in Vietnam had they said, yeah, we'll support your anti-colonial movement. But it's just another miscalculation. But Kathleen, I want to ask you, I want to go back to your book. And I want to ask you about, because as I was getting toward the end, I got the feeling we're going to see more of Malvina. And I got the feeling we might see her next in Kazakhstan.
Good guess. That's a very good guess. I would love to, I left the book open,
Yeah.
you know, probably for a sequel, and I would love to to write a sequel set in Kazakhstan the following year. Kazakhstan still provides 15% of the world's uranium.
Yeah.
And so the potential for a whole new set of villains and a whole new set of dangers would be right for that. The president of Kazakhstan for the last 30 years, Nursultan Nazarbayev, was actually probably the most proactive in ridding his country of nuclear weapons and embracing Western, Western technology. But again, that year, 1991, the following year, there was still a lot of intrigue going on. We ended up in Kazakhstan because Tehran petitioned Almaty, which was the capital of Kazakhstan at that time, to open an embassy, but not in Almaty, north of Almaty, not far from one of the uranium pits.
Yeah.
So there was still a lot of intrigue. So I thought, I think Malvina has some more adventures too.
Yeah. It would be good to read about them.
So we need to call Patrick into this conversation to see if he has questions from the audience. So Patrick, over to you.
Well, I just wanted to circle back on a couple of things that you had said earlier, and also you mentioned sort of the collective effect on this generation that survived, the ones that did survive World War II.
Yeah.
I don't know if I have a question really, but that's intriguing, this idea of a generation. I'm thinking of the American Civil War too, when you have these just unbelievable, casualties, how does that generation sort of, absorb that sort of psychic trauma, the effect of it going forward? Any thoughts on?
I think, Dan, I'd love for you to talk more about your main character, Emil Grimm, because he came up the ranks of Stasi, and what in your mind was his experience in the Second World War?
Yeah, he was pretty young. He was probably about 12 by the time the war ended, or if he'd been a couple of years older, he probably would have had a gun put in his hand for the final defense of the city, because they had some 14-year-olds doing that.
Right.
But he was mostly, surviving in basements during air raids, and they would tunnel between the houses and whatnot in case the house above collapsed or burned. So what was interesting was his detachment, or what he found fascinating, Emil found fascinating, was this guys about 10 to 15 years older, like Marcus Wolf, who were committed communists before the Nazis took over. And some of them, basically some of the communist families, went and spent the war in Moscow and learned to speak fluent Russian. And so they came back, and it was strange in Berlin, because for Berlin, all of the women in Berlin, the percentage of women in Berlin who were raped by Russian soldiers at the end of the war when they were occupied was so mind-boggling high that it's amazing that Russia was able to actually instill any kind of loyalty to the communist system, largely because of what they had unleashed on the population there. And the only way they were able to do it was guys like Marcus Wolf, these German communists who had ridden out the war in Moscow, came back, established the seeds of a new government in East Germany and the seeds of a new security service modeled on the KGB model, the sword and the shield. They even had the same slogan.
Right.
So Emil's experience, I think, was more probably of mistrusting the Russians implicitly, but realizing these are the people we're working with, and I will trust them because I trust my boss, Marcus Wolf, and these other people who brought us up from scratch. So,
Right.
yeah.
I love also, you know, you had a young CIA agent, Claire,
Yeah.
who's partnered with Clark Bauckham, the old guard.
Yeah.
And he kind of reminded me of a Michael Gambon character.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
a shabby dignity to him. And I just really, I loved the way you captured the disarray, the disintegration of, you know, of a society and people who were very loyal to the Stasi or the KGB now are left to fend for themselves. And do they go west? Do they go east? You know, where are they going to go? So that was really fascinating. Yeah.
And what is interesting in both these books is that whether it's nuclear secrets or whether it's, you know, identities of spies, secrets have their own half-life. I mean, whether it's, you know, it's almost like they're radioactive too. And so what was suddenly up for grabs in a lot of these places, whether the KGB local branch was questioning its own loyalty to Moscow, or whether, say, in the case of Berlin, where suddenly all of these Stasi guys were out of a job and looking to land safely, all of these secrets suddenly still had a half-life and they had a value. And some people wanted to cash in on them while they still had this half-life before they kind of, you know, turned to lead. But
Exactly.
it's fascinating stuff when you look at the secrets of spies. They might suddenly seem irrelevant, but they're still going to be valuable to a lot of people.
Right.
You know, Dan, that I just wrote that down. Secrets have their own half-life.
Yeah,
That's
don't steal that line because
that's a
I
hell of an opening line.
I just used it in something I'm writing the other day. So
That's good. Kathleen, can I ask you just one quick question? One of the things about that was so fascinating about Mel's, you know, her talents, as a super recognizer, was that at the end of the day, she had to go through this process almost of detoxing, you know, all the faces that she saw during the day. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, that was for dramatic effect. I've been in contact with Kelly Hersey, the super recognizer, and her at one time boss, Mike Neville, who's a detective chief inspector of Scotland Yard, and they both laughed when I told them about this ritual, because she said, I never get headaches, and I don't have to do you know, I don't have to do any kind of deprogramming. I put that in there as a flight of fancy to add some tension to kind of make this her attributes, her talent, a little bit dangerous to herself, that she had to go through this ritual to diffuse sort of the tension, the neuronal tension. But you know, I made it up so that it would, if she wasn't able to do the ritual, it would have disastrous consequences for her.
Yeah. And it certainly raised the stakes when she was under interrogation and in detention in places like that.
Right.
Let's see. So some of the questions that have come in. Bruce would like to know, let's see, Kathleen, given that you knew the Soviet Union at its end and you've seen Russia now, which do you see as being more dangerous?
Well, you know, there was a lot of trepidation because of all of the weapons of mass destruction that were sort of laying around. But there was a sense that because the Americans were there on the ground and Western Europeans, we kind of knew more of what was going on. Although Russia was not completely honest, was never completely honest in the way that they were going to destroy biochemical weapons, or you know, or nuclear weapons. They fudged a lot, and we kind of knew that, but we still had entree. we don't really know what Putin's up to. We know that he's not doing very well in Ukraine, that his forces are in disarray. But I don't know. There's still the open question of, is he willing to use limited nuclear strikes? I don't know. It feels more dangerous now, but only because I'm not there. Maybe being there gave me the false sense of security that we were actually getting something done.
It's amazing. It's been a whole year today.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
know.
Wow.
I know.
Yeah.
And he's
Yep.
effectively destroying, just like World War One destroyed a generation of young British men. He's basically destroying a whole generation of men for no purpose. And, that's going to have very long-term consequences for Russia. I think he can't afford to lose at this point because of the damage that he's done. The deaths that he's caused, the economic damage, he's driven out Western business, whatever. I don't think he can turn back. But
Well, also, yeah, a lot of bright young men are leaving the country too, because
too.
they
There's been a
fear
big-
that there may be
yeah.
more conscription and they're voting with their feet. I mean, they're getting out in droves.
There's a huge brain drain, which is
Yeah, there is.
kind of analogous to what happened in China with the Cultural Revolution, is that China lost a lot of its, superior
Yeah.
brain power and all over that policy. But I think Putin's basically backed himself into a place where he really can't get out of it. Anybody who thinks there can be a negotiated peace, I think, is
Now-
delusional.
Now,
Well,
it's interesting you
think-
mentioned brain drain, because wasn't Kathleen, maybe you know this, there was also some concern in 90 about Soviet nuclear talent, the scientists possibly going elsewhere to the highest bidder. Like you already had the Scottish guy. What was his name? You mentioned him in the book. Not Scottish, but the Canadian.
Canadian.
Yeah.
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 Yeah, that was one of the disturbing and really sad aspects of being in Belarus in the early 1990s is that when we would go to visit the institutes, the academic institutes, there would be lines of scientists, all different types of, chemical engineers and nuclear
Yeah.
scientists, waiting in a line outside of the door where we were to offer to sell their technology.
Yeah.
In lieu of payment, the Soviet Union, because all the work that they did was owned by the state. So
Yeah.
what they said in compromise, the Soviet system said, well, you can own what you've worked on, but we just can't pay you. But
Yeah.
they were desperate to sell. They said, we'll give this to you for however much money, and you can own it.
Yeah.
And that was very disturbing. And we had to keep an
Yeah.
eye on that because there was a big brain drain.
Yeah.
When the Soviet Union came apart. And the Nunn-Lugar program not only paid for decommissioning weapons, but it paid for housing and medical supplies for the military and for their top scientists, because we realized that if we didn't give them a way to survive, a way to live,
Yeah.
they were going to go to the next highest bidder.
Right. Exactly.
So yeah.
Anything else, Patrick?
Let's see. Well, what are you both working on now? What are your next projects?
Go ahead, Kathleen.
Oh, thanks, Dan. I'm working simultaneously on two projects to see which one will get the go ahead. One is a sequel set in Kazakhstan, and the other is a standalone book set in New York City in 1977, the summer of 1977, the Big Blackout. And it's kind of in the line of Dan Simmons. It's again a big pivot for me. It's something I haven't done before because it sort of verges on the supernatural. It involves Nikola Tesla and his particle beam weapon, and so it's sort of a fanciful. It's a dark fairy tale, and so I'm just developing it to see where it goes. So I'm working on both, and I'm going to present both to the publisher pretty soon, and then we'll see.
Is Betty on ice for the moment?
Is what?
Betty kind of on hold for a moment?
Yes, I'd love to write more Betty Rizek crime series. But I just felt that, and the publisher felt it was time to be. They were very excited about the spy novel, and so I'd love to go back to it, but I sort of made the change to move forward.
Right.
How about you, Dan?
I'm working on a spy novel set, pretty much contemporary, but it's set in a fictional Eastern European country, which is somewhat like Hungary, but is not. And it involves a discredited, somewhat canceled American comedian who had become a congressman who lost both those jobs because of really screwing up publicly. And but he happens to, his work, his very kind of crude comedy, one of his biggest fans happens to be the premier of this Eastern European country, who invites him over there on social media, which this guy misses because he's disengaged from all that. So the CIA basically decides to capitalize by basically getting him to take this invitation to try to get him into this fellow's inner circle. So there will be some comic elements in this book.
Oh, good.
But it will basically be, and it will lead into darker places that neither side had any intention for it to go, because they will discover that a lot of US politicians of a certain ilk also are big fans of this leader of this Eastern European country. And this guy starts to discover things which maybe the CIA isn't sure it even wants to handle. So it gets quite complicated. And anyway, that's where I am with that book. So
I'm so disappointed I won't get to go to Budapest then with you. It's one of my favorite cities. There's nothing else just to eat there. I love it.
Well, you can go to this. You can go to this city. The capital city is Blatsk, and it's in the country of Bolrovia. So anyway,
is there a great river running through it?
There is.
Excellent. Well, that'll all work out. Is that it, Patrick? Did you have anything else of your own?
No, I think that's about it.
Wonderful. Well, thank you both very much. What fun this has been. I think we have maybe 4 copies left, signed copies. We obviously have an infinity number of unsigned copies of Black Wolf, but very small. And as Patrick already mentioned to you, we're down to 3 copies of Winterwork because we had a lot of them back when Dan, but when was it that we published?
Oh, July.
Okay.
July was published.
So we try to hold on to our signed books forever. So anyway, here we are.
Thank you again, Barbara. Thank you, Patrick. And thank you, Kathleen.
Thank you, Dan. Barbara, as always, and Patrick, I love Poison Pen, and I'm so grateful that you invited Dan and I to talk this evening about
it was our pleasure. You are indeed 2 of our favorite authors. So thank you so much. Good night, everybody. Enjoy the rest of the
night.
Good night.
Good night.
Hello. We hope you're enjoying our programs and podcasts with authors. We'd like to expand them, and your help would be appreciated. Please make a donation at poisonedpenfoundation.org. 100% of the proceeds will go to help connect authors with readers in this difficult time. Thank you.